The wind howled through the dusty streets of the small Kansas town, carrying with it the chill of late October. Marcus Webb, a rugged, 32-year-old widower, gripped the reins of his tired horse as he guided the wagon slowly toward the general store. Beside him sat his daughter, Sarah, a bright-eyed 7-year-old with her mother's gentle smile. In the back of the wagon, their youngest, baby James, slept soundly, his tiny body wrapped in a woolen blanket. Marcus's heart was heavy. It had been a long, hard few months since his wife passed. The grief still stung like a fresh wound, especially now, as they ventured into yet another town, desperately seeking work. It had been a fruitless journey so far. The ranches, the farms, they all turned him away. The reason? He had children. No one wanted to hire a man with 2 mouths to feed, especially when a reliable worker was needed. And children, well, they were seen as a burden. They had been rejected from 5 places now, each no less brutal than the last. As Marcus pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store, his shoulders sagged under the weight of his failure. He had no more money to offer, no more pride to lose. They were barely scraping by, and each day felt like a battle he couldn't win. "Papa, can we buy the ribbons?" Sarah's soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Her big brown eyes shone with innocent hope as she pointed to the colorful ribbons in the store window. Marcus swallowed hard, feeling the sting of shame and helplessness. He glanced down at the 2 pennies he had left in his pocket, knowing it wasn't enough. He shook his head, his voice tight. "I don't have money, my girl," he replied softly. The words hung in the air between them like a cloud. Sarah's face fell, her lips trembling slightly. It wasn't the first time he had to turn her down, but it always hurt just the same. The world seemed so large, so unforgiving, and he felt so small, so powerless to change their fate. Inside the store, the owner, a gruff man named Mr. Hutchins, watched them from behind the counter with a disapproving look. Marcus could feel the cold eyes of the other customers, their whispers just loud enough for him to hear. There was no place for a man like him here. Marcus quickly turned, ready to leave, but then, as if summoned by the weight of his shame, a voice rang out from the doorway. "Stand up, Mr. Webb," came the calm, commanding voice. Marcus's head snapped up, and he froze. There, standing in the doorway, was Catherine Hartwell. Catherine Hartwell was a woman unlike any Marcus had ever met. At 35, she was a widow, a woman whose beauty was tempered with a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her very presence. She was dressed in black, her widow's attire giving her an air of dignity and mystery. Her dark eyes locked onto Marcus's with a calm intensity that sent a ripple through him. "What do you mean, ma'am?" Marcus stammered, his voice rough. She didn't answer directly, but instead, her eyes flicked to Sarah, who stood at Marcus's side, looking up at the woman with a shy curiosity. Catherine's gaze softened slightly before she turned her attention back to Marcus. "I see you've been rejected," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of something else. Sympathy, perhaps? And yet, you're still here, still trying. That's something rare in a man. For a moment, Marcus just stared at her, unsure of what to say. He was used to being seen as less than nothing, a failure, not someone worthy of help. But here she was, speaking to him as though he had value. Catherine took a step forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. She glanced at the other customers in the store, who were now watching the scene unfold with growing interest. "Mr. Webb," she continued, her tone now firm, "I have need of a worker. I'm willing to offer you a chance." Marcus blinked, stunned. "A chance?" he repeated. "Yes," she replied. "Come with me." As Marcus followed Catherine outside, the wind biting at his skin, he couldn't help but wonder what had just happened. She was offering him something, a chance, a job, an opportunity, but for what cost? His pride warned him to turn away. He wasn't the kind of man who took charity. He wasn't the kind of man who relied on anyone but himself. But Catherine didn't seem to be offering charity. There was something practical about her offer, something that spoke to him in a way he hadn't expected. "Wait," Catherine called as he hesitated. She walked up to him, the movement fluid and purposeful, and then looked down at his rough, calloused hands. Her eyes flicked briefly to Sarah and James, who were now waiting beside the wagon. "I've got a small cabin," she said. "It's yours for as long as you need it. I'll provide meals and a wage, but it will be less than what you might earn elsewhere. It's not much, but I can offer you stability." Marcus felt his heart skip. Stability. It was all he had wanted for his children. Something steady, something certain. But at what cost? He had no skills beyond farming, beyond the hard labor he'd been doing for years. He had no business taking anything from anyone, especially not a wealthy widow. He opened his mouth to refuse, to tell her that he didn't take charity, that he would find his own way. But then he stopped. He looked at Sarah, at James, and he realized how tired he was. How tired they all were. I don't take charity, ma'am," he said, his voice heavy with pride and shame. Catherine's gaze softened. She seemed to understand. "This isn't charity, Mr. Webb," she replied. "This is business. I need workers, and you need a roof over your head. This isn't a handout, it's a deal. You work, you earn. That's all." Marcus thought for a long moment. He didn't have any other options. His pride, his dignity, they were meaningless in the face of his children's needs. He nodded slowly, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his shoulders. "All right," he said. "I'll accept your offer, ma'am." That night, Marcus settled his children into their small, two-room cabin. The space was modest, but enough for them to survive the harsh winter. As he tucked Sarah into bed, her small face lit up with hope. Marcus couldn't help but wonder about Catherine Hartwell. Through the window, he could see the large main house. A single lamp burned in the upstairs window, casting a faint glow in the darkness. It was a lonely sight. Marcus couldn't help but wonder what it was like for Catherine, a widow living alone in that big house, so different from his own humble cabin. "Why is the nice lady all alone in that big house, Papa?" Sarah asked, her voice soft with sleep. Marcus's voice was gentle as he answered, "Some questions aren't ours to ask, darling." But as he turned off the light and laid down beside his children, he too wondered. Why was Catherine alone? What was she running from? As the wind howled outside, Marcus's mind raced. This was just the beginning. But what came next would change everything. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus and his children had arrived at Hartwell Ranch. It was a rough start, but they had settled into a routine. Marcus worked hard, just as he always had. He was up before dawn and worked until the light faded, doing everything from mending fences to repairing the barn. His hands were calloused and raw, his back sore from the labor, but it was honest work, and he was grateful for it. Sarah helped Mrs. Patterson, the elderly cook, in the main house kitchen, learning to stir the soup and peel potatoes with the same patience and care her mother had taught her. Baby James, now a little older and more mobile, spent his days crawling around the cabin, occasionally shrieking with laughter or getting into mischief, much to Marcus's amusement. The days were long and tiring, but there was something peaceful about the rhythm of life at the ranch. Catherine had kept her word, offering them a modest home and a wage. Her offer, though less than what he could earn elsewhere, provided the stability Marcus had desperately needed. He didn't ask for more, didn't demand anything beyond what was agreed upon. He worked hard, and though he wasn't sure how much Catherine had noticed, he was starting to notice her more, particularly how she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. There were moments when their eyes would meet across the barn or the yard, and for a brief instant, Marcus felt a connection, a pull he didn't understand, nor did he want to. Catherine was a widow, and he was a simple farmhand. There was no future in that, only complications he didn't want to entertain. But as the days passed, he couldn't ignore the small things that lingered in the corners of his mind. Catherine was always watching him, always noticing. It wasn't just the way she would stand by the kitchen window, silently observing as he worked. It was the way she smiled at Sarah when the girl helped her carry in firewood, the way she softened when she saw the bond between Marcus and his children. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the stirrings of something deeper than just gratitude. It was when baby James became ill that everything changed. The fever hit suddenly, without warning. James had been fine that morning, laughing as Marcus bundled him up to go out and tend to the animals. But by the afternoon, his small body was burning with fever, his skin flushed red, his breathing shallow and ragged. Marcus panicked. He had already lost his wife to illness, a fever that had taken her too quickly. Now, the thought of losing his son was too much to bear. He held James in his arms, trembling, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to do. The cold sweat on his forehead made it worse. He felt helpless. He didn't have a doctor to call, not in this remote place. The ranch was miles from the nearest town. He couldn't even imagine making it to town in time. With no choice, he ran to the main house, bursting through the door without thinking. Catherine was sitting in the parlor, her back to him, when he shouted for her. She turned quickly, her face going pale as she saw the panic in his eyes. "What is it, Mr. Webb?" she asked, rising from her chair, her hands moving instinctively to her hips. "It's James," Marcus said breathlessly, his voice tight. "He's burning with fever. I don't know what to do." Catherine's face softened instantly. Without a word, she crossed the room in 3 quick strides, her hands reaching out to take the child from Marcus's arms. She didn't hesitate. She didn't falter. Her calmness in the face of his panic stunned him. "Put him down here," she said, motioning to the couch. She quickly began to assess James, checking his temperature with practiced ease. Marcus watched, frozen, as she worked. It was as if she had done this before. The years of grief he had buried deep inside him came to the surface in that moment. A rush of raw emotion he hadn't expected. He could barely stand the thought of losing another person he loved. "He'll be all right, Mr. Webb," Catherine said softly, her voice steady and reassuring. "I'm going to make him comfortable. He just needs time." She was a stranger to him, yet in that moment, she was his lifeline. She moved about with purpose, boiling water for a hot compress, preparing medicine from a small cabinet, and applying a cool cloth to James's forehead. Marcus stood there, still as a statue, watching her work with quiet authority. He had expected nothing from her, but there she was, tending to his son as if he were her own. "I can't lose him too," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking as the weight of everything. The loss of his wife, the fear of losing his child, became too much to bear. Catherine paused for a moment, glancing up at him. Her expression softened, and she moved closer. "You're a good father, Mr. Webb. She would be proud of you." Marcus shook his head, his heart heavy with grief. "It doesn't matter. I'm all they have left. If I lose them," his voice trailed off, the fear too much to speak aloud. Catherine didn't speak for a moment, but when she did, her words were simple and honest. "You're doing the best you can, and that's all anyone can ask of you." It was the first time she had spoken to him like this, without the distance, without the formality. And it made something inside Marcus stir. It made him feel seen in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. The rest of the night passed in a blur. The storm outside raged, but inside, Marcus and Catherine were silent, save for the occasional sound of James's restless movements or the soft crackle of the fire. Catherine worked tirelessly through the night, cooling James's fever with cloths and offering him sips of water. As the hours passed, Marcus began to relax, watching her, waiting. Eventually, James's fever began to subside, his small body cooling down. He still slept fitfully, but he was breathing more steadily. Catherine glanced over at Marcus, offering a small smile, one that was filled with quiet relief. But even as the child rested, something had changed between them. They had shared a moment of vulnerability, of mutual understanding, and it felt like the walls that had kept them apart were slowly beginning to crack. They didn't speak of it, not in words, but the tension between them shifted. It was a subtle change, but Marcus could feel it, deep in his bones. The days that followed were filled with a new awareness. Catherine had always been a figure of distance for him. Her wealth, her position, her widowhood. She was a woman of strength, of business, of practicality. He had never once considered what might lie beneath the surface of her polished exterior. But now, as he watched her from the corner of his eye, he began to see the small things, the quiet sadness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, the way she kept to herself at dinner, the unspoken loneliness that seemed to hang around her like a shadow. She ate alone, always, and when she spoke, it was almost always about the ranch, about business. She was a woman who had lost so much, her husband, her family, her dreams, and it made Marcus wonder how long she had been holding herself together, pretending to be strong when, inside, she was just as fragile as he was. His thoughts were interrupted one day when he saw her standing by the kitchen window, watching him as he worked in the yard. There was something about the way her eyes lingered on him, something that made his heart race. It was a simple thing, but it lingered. In the days that followed, Marcus began to notice other things, small gestures, moments of quiet understanding. He would fix a broken fence, and she would watch him, her gaze soft. She would smile when he taught Sarah to read, her eyes filled with something like warmth. But it was never spoken. They never spoke of it. Neither of them did. It was as if something unspoken hovered between them, a silent understanding that neither could yet name. But Marcus couldn't ignore it. He was drawn to her in ways he didn't understand. And the more he resisted, the harder it became to pretend that it was just about the work. Saturday finally arrived, and with it, the long-anticipated trip to town. Marcus was apprehensive. The journey itself was something of a relief. He hadn't been to town in months, and he could feel the weight of the isolation beginning to settle on his shoulders. Catherine had insisted on the trip, suggesting it would be a good opportunity for Sarah to see the town, and for James, who hadn't been off the ranch since his arrival, to stretch his legs. But as Marcus loaded the wagon with supplies for the journey, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. It was just a short ride to town, but for Marcus, it felt like a strange turning point, as if everything he'd been avoiding in his own heart was about to come rushing to the surface. Sarah was excited, her face bright with anticipation as she bounced in the back of the wagon, eager for the sights and sounds of the town she hadn't visited in months. James, still too young to understand the significance of the trip, sat quietly in his lap, his thumb in his mouth as he watched the world around him. Catherine, ever the picture of calm, sat beside Marcus, her expression unreadable as always. The ride was slow, the wagon creaking under the weight of the supplies, and a sharp wind biting through the cold autumn air. The landscape stretched out before them in shades of golden brown, the trees barren and the fields empty, all signs of the harsh winter that would soon set in. Yet there was something comforting in the steady pace of the journey, the familiarity of the well-worn path, the quiet rhythm of the horses' hooves against the earth. As they approached the small town, Marcus noticed the bustle of activity. The market square was busy, with farmers, shopkeepers, and townsfolk going about their business. People were laughing, haggling, exchanging goods. Life was continuing as normal. But for Marcus, it felt like a world apart. He had never quite belonged in the town, never quite fit in with the people who lived there. His life, the life of a farmhand, was always just on the outskirts of their world, never quite reaching the center of it. When they arrived at the mercantile, Catherine went off to handle business, leaving Marcus and the children to wander through the market. Sarah, her eyes wide with excitement, ran ahead, pulling Marcus along as they explored the stalls. The scent of fresh bread filled the air, and the clatter of wooden crates and boxes echoed through the square. It was all so simple, so far removed from the harshness of the ranch life. And for a moment, Marcus allowed himself to enjoy it. But that peace was short-lived. As they walked toward the general store, Sarah's attention was drawn to a display of blue ribbons in the window. She stopped in front of them, her eyes alight with desire. "Papa, can we buy them?" she asked, her voice soft and hopeful. Marcus's heart sank. He had no money left. The last of their funds had been spent on medicine for James, and the rent had already been paid. He glanced down at Sarah, who was looking up at him with those wide, trusting eyes. It was a small request, a simple thing, but he couldn't grant it. "Not this time. I don't have money, my girl," he said, his voice tight. Her face fell, and she looked away, trying to hide the disappointment. Marcus felt like the world was crushing down on him. He hated that he couldn't give her something so simple, something so small. He hated the way it made him feel, like he was failing her in the most basic way. The store owner, a surly man named Mr. Hutchins, was watching the scene from inside the store. Marcus could feel his eyes on him, could feel the judgment. He quickly turned and ushered the children out of the store, wanting to leave before the embarrassment became too much to bear. But just as they reached the door, Catherine appeared, stepping out from the shadows of the mercantile. The moment she stepped into the street, everything seemed to freeze. The other shoppers stopped and stared, the chatter in the market quieting as her presence seemed to command the attention of everyone in the square. Marcus froze, unsure of what would happen next. He didn't want to cause any more trouble, didn't want to bring attention to his failure. But Catherine didn't hesitate. She walked straight toward the store, her gaze fixed on Mr. Hutchins. The store owner's expression faltered for a moment, his face going pale as he saw Catherine approach. "Mrs. Hartwell," he stammered, his tone shifting from indifference to fear. Catherine didn't spare him another glance. She turned to Marcus, her eyes meeting his for the first time in days. There was something in them, something soft, something understanding. But she didn't speak to him. She spoke to Hutchins. "I saw exactly how you treat my employees, Mr. Hutchins," she said, her voice cold and commanding. There was no anger in her words, no bitterness, just pure, unflinching authority. The crowd around them shifted uncomfortably, but Catherine didn't care. "I'll be purchasing those ribbons for Sarah," she continued, her tone as firm as steel. She knelt down to Sarah's level and gently tied the blue ribbons in her hair. "There," she said softly, "a gift for you." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but Catherine raised a hand, silencing him. She stood up and turned to Hutchins. "The Hartwell account will be settled by the end of the month," she said. "But from now on, I'll be taking my business elsewhere. Miller's Mercantile has far better service." Hutchins's face drained of color as he realized the weight of her words. The Hartwell account was one of his largest sources of income. Without it, his store would be in serious trouble. He stammered a few incoherent words, but Catherine didn't listen. She simply turned and walked back toward the wagon, her head held high. Marcus stood there, stunned. The whole scene had unfolded so quickly, so decisively. Catherine had made her point without hesitation, without a single glance at him. He couldn't quite decide whether he was grateful or embarrassed. "Ma'am, I can't accept," he started, his voice low. But Catherine simply shook her head, cutting him off. "You'll accept what's given," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "They're not charity. They're a gift. Nothing more, nothing less." As they made their way back to the wagon, Marcus could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on them. Some looked away, some whispered behind their hands, but Catherine seemed unaffected. She climbed into the wagon, and for the first time, Marcus saw something new in her eyes, a kind of defiance, a strength that had been buried beneath the surface. As they headed back to the ranch, a tense silence hung between them. Marcus, still processing what had just happened, could feel the weight of Catherine's presence beside him. The wind had picked up and the sky had darkened, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by what had transpired, by the way Catherine had stood up for him, for Sarah, for all of them. But he also couldn't ignore the deeper, unspoken tension between them, the feelings he had tried so hard to suppress. "You didn't have to make a scene," he said finally, breaking the silence. "People will talk." Catherine didn't flinch. Let them talk, she replied coolly. I'm tired of silence. He glanced at her, his heart pounding. About you. About us. There is no us, ma'am. She turned to him, her gaze steady and unwavering. Isn't there? She asked quietly. The question hung in the air, unanswered, and Marcus felt his chest tighten. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? They were too different. A ranch owner, a farmhand. No future, no chance. And yet, the silence between them spoke volumes. He wanted to say something, to explain, to push the thoughts and feelings aside. But for the first time, he wasn't sure he could. The wagon rumbled on, the road ahead uncertain, the distance between them both growing and narrowing in the same breath. The following morning, Marcus could feel the tension in the air as soon as he stepped out of the cabin. The ranch, usually bustling with activity, felt heavier than usual, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The air was thick with gossip, and he could hear the whispers from the other ranch hands as he passed by them. Did you hear about what happened in town? One of them muttered, and another responded, Catherine Hartwell making a scene over a farmhand? It's not right. Marcus felt the weight of their words like a physical blow. He had never been the kind of man to care about the opinions of others. But now, with his children depending on him and the ranch giving them sense of stability, he couldn't ignore it. He had spent his life fighting against judgment, against the assumptions made about him because of his station in life, and now it seemed like those same judgments were being applied to Catherine. It was hard to ignore the way the ranch hands looked at him when they passed by, their eyes filled with pity and disdain. He could feel their whispers following him, their judgment of the situation a constant weight on his shoulders. Catherine's actions in town had stirred the pot in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. She had always been a figure of authority, distant and unapproachable in his eyes, but now she was more than that. She was a woman who had made a decision, who had acted with a level of defiance that unsettled everyone around her. Marcus couldn't help but wonder what had driven her to do it, what had made her stand up for him and Sarah in front of the whole town. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, and it wasn't just because of the ribbons or the scene in town. She had seen something in him, something that he didn't fully understand, and that made him uneasy. He had spent so long hiding behind his pride, keeping his emotions buried, that the idea of someone else seeing through it, someone else seeing his vulnerabilities, scared him. And yet, Catherine had done just that. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Catherine had made it clear that she wasn't afraid of the consequences of her actions, but Marcus wasn't so sure. He was still wrestling with his own pride, with his own fear of being seen as weak, as someone who depended on others. And then there was Douglas, the head foreman, who had made it clear that he didn't approve of Catherine's actions. The next morning, as Marcus was finishing his breakfast, he saw Douglas standing by the main house, waiting for Catherine. His posture was rigid, his expression stern. When Catherine arrived, the conversation started immediately, low but heated, with Douglas's voice carrying just enough for Marcus to catch a few words. Ma'am, you embarrassed yourself in town, Douglas was saying. Over a farmhand, no less. Marcus felt his chest tighten. It was clear that Douglas was trying to assert control over the situation, trying to remind Catherine of the place she had a hold as the ranch owner, the leader of the operation. People are talking, Catherine, Douglas continued, his tone condescending. They're saying you've let your grief cloud your judgment. You're letting yourself be compromised by the man you hired. That's dangerous. Catherine's face remained calm, her eyes unreadable as she listened. Marcus felt a knot in his stomach, a sense of dread creeping over him. He didn't want to be the cause of division, of trouble for Catherine. He was just a farmhand, a man with nothing to offer but his labor, and now it seemed like he had become the center of a storm that threatened to tear the ranch apart. You may be right, Catherine said, her voice measured but firm. But I'm still the owner of this ranch, Douglas. Not you. There was a long pause, and for a moment, Marcus thought Douglas would argue further, but instead, he huffed and turned away, his boots echoing on the wooden floorboards as he walked off. Marcus couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and unease. He knew Douglas would never be truly happy with the arrangement, but he also knew that Catherine had made her decision. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was personal, and that was something he hadn't expected. As the day wore on, Marcus went about his work, trying to focus on the tasks at hand. But everywhere he went, he could feel the eyes of the ranch hands on him, could hear the whispers just out of earshot. It was all too much, and he found himself questioning whether it was worth it, whether this job, this life, was worth the price he was paying. Later that afternoon, as he was working on the fence near the eastern pasture, he overheard two of the ranch hands talking. "Did you see how she looked at him?" One of them said, his voice low. "Catherine Hartwell's sweet on that farmhand. You can tell. She's letting him walk all over her." The other man chuckled, but there was a bitterness to his laugh. "What do you expect? A man with children. He's got nowhere to go. He'll take what he can get." Marcus's blood ran cold at the words. He knew they were talking about him, and for the first time, he felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had always prided himself on being strong, on being self-sufficient, but now it felt like everything he had built was crumbling. He didn't want to be seen as a man who had taken advantage of someone's kindness, someone's charity. He wanted to stand on his own, to prove that he could provide for his children without anyone's help. But here he was, in the midst of a situation that felt too complicated to escape. That night, after the workday ended, Marcus found himself standing by the fire, staring into the flames as the embers crackled. He wasn't sure how long he had been standing there when Sarah came up behind him, her small hand tugging at his sleeve. "Papa, are we leaving?" she asked softly. Her voice was so innocent, so trusting, that it almost broke his heart. He crouched down to her level, trying to mask the turmoil in his chest. "Might be best, darling," he said quietly, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. She frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "But I like it here. Mrs. Patterson teaches me to read. And Miss Catherine," she trailed off, her eyes searching his face. "What about Miss Catherine?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. Sarah's face lit up with a small smile. "She smiles now, Papa. She didn't before we came." Marcus swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. He had never been good at talking to Sarah about feelings, about things he couldn't understand himself. "It's more complicated than that, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice strained. "Why do grown-ups make everything complicated?" she asked, her small voice full of confusion and wisdom. Marcus didn't have an answer. He didn't know how to explain the weight of pride, of shame, of fear, and how those things made everything more difficult than it needed to be. He wished he could tell her that things would be simpler, that life could be easy, but he knew better than that. Life wasn't easy. It was full of choices, full of consequences, and sometimes there was no right answer. The next day, as Marcus prepared to leave the ranch for town, he was startled by the arrival of a fancy carriage. The sight of it made his stomach drop. Richard Hartwell, Catherine's brother-in-law, stepped out of the carriage, a look of smug superiority on his face. He was dressed in fine clothes, his shoes polished, his posture rigid. He didn't look like someone who cared about the ranch or its workers. He looked like someone who wanted to take it all away. "I've come for what's mine," Richard said, his voice cold as he stepped toward Catherine. "The ranch is no longer yours, Catherine. Your late husband's will is clear. You're not fit to run this place. I'll be buying it from you, and you'll leave." Catherine's face went pale, but she stood tall. "You'll have to take it from me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Richard sneered. "I have lawyers. They'll tie you up in court for years. You'll lose everything." Marcus stood in the background, watching, helpless. He wanted to say something, to stand up for Catherine, but he couldn't. He wasn't in a position to fight for her, not in the way she needed. He wasn't anything but a farmhand, a man who had nothing to offer, but his labor. Catherine turned to him, her eyes sharp. "Leave," she said quietly. "Take your children. I'll deal with him." But Marcus hesitated. He couldn't leave her now, not when she needed him the most. The days after Richard Hartwell's visit were filled with a heavy silence that hung over the ranch like a thick fog. Marcus could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him as he continued his work, his thoughts constantly drifting to Catherine's confrontation with her brother-in-law. Richard's words echoed in his mind. He would tie her up in legal battles, drag her through the courts, and take everything she had built. Marcus had never imagined that something so personal, so destructive, could come from someone who should have been family. The ranch was Catherine's livelihood, her home, and now it felt like it was all hanging by a thread. Marcus, too, felt like he was on the edge of a precipice. Every day, he was reminded of his place. He was just a farmhand, someone with nothing to offer but hard work and the will to survive. He had already seen how people viewed him, how the whispers followed him everywhere. And now, it seemed like Catherine's own blood wanted to strip everything away from her. The ranch hands had started to pull back, their glances more wary, more calculating. They watched Marcus with a kind of detached curiosity, as though waiting for the inevitable fallout from his position on the ranch. But none of them spoke to him directly, and he didn't dare approach them. He wasn't sure if it was their uncertainty or their disapproval that bothered him more, but the silence between them grew unbearable. And yet, despite all this, he couldn't bring himself to leave. Catherine's quiet strength, her refusal to let her brother-in-law bully her, kept him rooted. He had seen her stand her ground, and though he knew she wasn't immune to the weight of her situation, he couldn't help but admire her resolve. The storm outside, which had been building for days, finally broke that evening. The wind howled across the plains, the sky darkened, and snow began to fall in thick, swirling sheets. The temperature dropped quickly, and Marcus knew they were in for something fierce. He had been out in the far pasture when the first gusts of wind had begun to howl, but now, as he made his way back toward the ranch, the storm was fully upon him. Snow whipped across the ground in thick sheets, the wind stinging his face, biting at his exposed skin. The cold felt like it was eating him alive, but he pushed forward, his thoughts more focused on getting back to the warmth of the cabin than anything else. When he reached the barn, he knew there was no time to waste. The storm was coming hard, and the animals needed to be secured. The ranch hands had already started gathering the livestock inside, but Marcus had to check the farthest pasture himself. He could see the darkening clouds, the swirling snow in the distance, and knew that time was running out. He didn't waste any more time. He gathered the two ranch hands still in the barn and mounted his horse, heading out into the thickening storm. The wind was howling now, the snow a blinding white blur. Visibility was almost non-existent, and Marcus had to strain his eyes to make out the figures of the horses ahead. The storm was moving in fast, and it was impossible to tell how much time they had before it would be too late to return. As they moved further out into the pasture, the weather grew worse. The snow whipped against them, the cold sinking into their bones, but Marcus pushed forward, urging his horse on. It was difficult to see the animals through the snow, but he could hear them, their restless movements in the blinding white expanse. They had to be gathered quickly before the storm became a full-blown blizzard. But as they reached the farthest point of the pasture, one of the ranch hands shouted that they'd spotted a calf separated from a herd. Marcus's heart sank. A single animal was vulnerable in the storm, and they couldn't afford to lose any livestock. He turned to the others and shouted, "I'll go after it. You head back to the barn." Without waiting for a response, Marcus spurred his horse forward, cutting through the snow toward the struggling calf. It was a dangerous decision, riding further away from the barn into the heart of the storm, but he had no choice. The animal needed help, and he couldn't leave it to fend for itself. The wind screamed in his ears, the snow biting at his face, but Marcus didn't stop. The calf was stumbling through the snow, its legs weak, its movements slow. Marcus's heart raced as he reached the animal, reaching out to grab its rope and lead it back toward the barn. But the storm was so thick now, the snow so heavy, that it was almost impossible to see where he was going. The snow had turned into a wall, and the wind pushed against him, making it harder and harder to move. He turned his horse around, tried to retrace his steps, but everything was a blur. The world had been swallowed by the storm. He knew he had to get back to the barn, but the snow was relentless. His horse struggled through the drifts, moving slower with each step. The cold seeped into his bones, and he knew they were running out of time. He had no choice but to push forward. He couldn't see the barn anymore. He couldn't even see the other ranch hands. It was just him, the horse, and the storm. The snow kept falling, the wind howling like a living thing, and Marcus knew they were lost. Panic started to creep into his chest. He had led the calf back into the storm, and now he was leading himself deeper into the blizzard. Every direction seemed the same, and the distance between him and safety grew with each passing moment. He could barely see his own horse, barely feel his hands in the biting cold. The storm had taken everything from him. Marcus pushed through the white-out conditions, the world around him a blur. His mind raced. Was he going the right way? Were the others heading back to find him? Was anyone coming to help? His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tightening as the cold began to numb his limbs. He couldn't stop now. The wind screamed louder, drowning out his thoughts, and everything became a swirl of white. His body was shaking uncontrollably now, his muscles stiffening from the cold, but he couldn't stop moving. He had to find the barn. He had to get back before it was too late. That was the only thing that mattered. The world was growing darker, the wind louder, and Marcus could feel his grip on the reins weakening. He had no idea how much time had passed when he finally saw a dark shape ahead of him. Another person, a figure in the snow, riding toward him. It was Catherine. She had come for him. The realization hit him like a thunderclap, and a wave of relief washed over him as he saw her through the snow. She had come, despite the storm, despite the danger. She had risked everything to find him. Marcus barely had time to register what was happening before she reached him, pulling him from his horse and helping him onto her own. "You're not dying out here, Marcus Webb," she said through gritted teeth, her voice barely audible over the storm. Marcus didn't have the strength to respond. The storm had taken everything from him, and now all he could do was cling to her as she rode through the blizzard, her determination burning brighter than the storm itself. They finally made it back to the ranch, both of them half frozen, but alive. Marcus was barely conscious when they reached the warmth of the main house. But Catherine wouldn't let go of him, wouldn't let him fade. She didn't say anything more. She just held him, keeping him alive, keeping him with her. And in that moment, Marcus realized that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm he had been carrying inside himself. And now, maybe, he didn't have to carry it alone anymore. Marcus awoke the next morning with a pounding headache and a body that felt like it had been run over by a stampede. His limbs were stiff, his muscles sore, and his mind foggy from the events of the previous day. But when he opened his eyes, he found himself lying in a warm bed, blankets pulled tight around him, and the faint smell of fresh bread and coffee in the air. His first thought was that he had died, that the storm had taken him, but then he heard a soft voice. "You're awake," Catherine's voice, warm and steady, reached him, and he blinked, trying to focus. She was sitting in a chair by the fire, her expression soft but tired. "I thought I lost you," she added quietly, her voice carrying the weight of something deeper, something unspoken. Marcus couldn't find the words to respond. His throat was dry, his lips cracked from the cold, and all he could do was nod slightly. Catherine stood and moved to the bedside, placing a hand on his forehead. "You're lucky I found you," she said, her fingers brushing his hair back gently. "If I hadn't come looking for you," she stopped herself, as though the thought was too painful to continue. Marcus swallowed hard, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to express the gratitude he felt, the fear that had gripped him when he thought he was lost to her forever. The silence between them was thick, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The storm had passed, but something else lingered in the air, a quiet understanding, a recognition of the fragile thread that held them both together. Catherine sat down beside him, her hand still resting on the edge of the bed. "Richard left this morning," she said, her voice steady but with a quiet edge. "He's gone back to St. Louis. The lawyers were threatening to contest the will, but I've got the ranch's financial records, and they prove I'm fit to manage it. I don't know what he was hoping to accomplish, but I won't let him take this from me." Marcus listened, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and admiration. Catherine was strong, even in the face of everything that had happened, even when it seemed like the world was against her. He had seen her stand her ground in town, and now he saw her doing the same with her brother-in-law. But there was something else in her voice, something raw, something that made Marcus realize just how much she had been carrying on her own. He had seen her as the ranch owner, the woman who could handle everything, but he had never stopped to consider the toll it had taken on her. "I'm glad you're safe," he finally managed to say, his voice rough. Catherine smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "We're both lucky," she replied softly, "but I need to know that you're okay. You almost didn't make it out there. I couldn't lose you." Marcus turned his head to look at her, his eyes searching hers for something he couldn't name. He had never been good with words, never been the kind of man who expressed his feelings easily, but he felt something deep inside him stirring, something he couldn't ignore. The way she looked at him now, the way she cared for him, made him realize just how much he had come to rely on her strength, her compassion. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something more, something he hadn't allowed himself to believe in for so long. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been so proud, so afraid. I didn't want to depend on anyone, not after everything that's happened. But I see now." He stopped himself, not sure how to continue, how to say what had been on his heart for so long. Catherine leaned in, her hand brushing against his. "You don't have to apologize," she said quietly. "We're both carrying our burdens, Marcus, but you don't have to carry them alone anymore." Her words hung in the air, a promise, a hope. Marcus swallowed, feeling the weight of the truth in her statement. He had been so determined to stand on his own, to protect his children and preserve his dignity, that he had never allowed himself to see what was right in front of him. Catherine had been offering him more than just a job, more than just a roof over their heads. She had been offering him a chance to belong, to be a part of something bigger than himself. And for the first time in a long time, he realized that he wanted it. He wanted her. He wanted to be with her, not because of necessity or obligation, but because she had become the one person who understood him, who saw him for who he truly was. As they sat in the quiet warmth of the cabin, the world outside seemed to disappear. The storm had passed, the danger had passed, but there was still something that needed to be said between them. Marcus reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and touched hers. Catherine didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand gently, her eyes soft. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happens now, Marcus," she replied, "is that we move forward, together." He looked at her, searching her face for any sign of doubt, but there was none. There was only the quiet certainty of a woman who had fought for everything she had and a man who had been given a second chance. Together, he repeated the word, feeling like a weight lifting off his chest. The next few days passed in a blur. Marcus recovered from the storm, his body slowly regaining strength as he spent time with Sarah and James. Catherine, too, was busy with the ranch, overseeing the work and making sure that everything was in order. But there was something different now, something that had shifted between them. They no longer kept their distance. There were shared glances, quiet moments, and the unspoken understanding that had been building between them. It wasn't just about work anymore. It was about the future, about what they could build together. A week later, Marcus found himself walking into the town mercantile once more, this time with Catherine by his side. Sarah was with them, her little hand in Marcus's, and James was in his arms, babbling happily. They stepped into the store, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt at peace. The familiar shelves, the scent of fresh bread, and the bustle of the townsfolk didn't seem so foreign now. They were part of the world, part of the community. As they walked through the store, Sarah ran ahead, her excitement palpable as she spotted the blue ribbons once again. This time when she asked, Marcus smiled and nodded. Yes, Sarah, we can buy them. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to him. As they paid for the ribbons, Catherine reached out, taking Marcus's hand in hers. For Sarah's Christmas dress, she said, her voice warm. I'm making it. Marcus felt his heart swell. This was their life now, and it wasn't perfect. There would be challenges ahead, more storms to weather, but for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't alone in facing them. They had each other. They were building something together, and that was all that mattered. The rest of the town may have been watching, may have been whispering behind their backs, but none of that mattered. They had each other, and that, in the end, was enough. As they left the store, Marcus turned to Catherine, his heart full. Catherine Hartwell, will you marry me? He asked, dropping to one knee in the snow, the world around them quiet, the falling snowflakes soft and gentle. Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she smiled, pulling him up and kissing him in front of the whole town. I don't need you on your knees, she whispered. I need you beside me. They kissed again, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt at home.